"Don't eat that." The words weren't spoken. They were written, pressed into a folded piece of paper no larger than a receipt, tucked just beneath the rim of a porcelain plate carrying a perfectly seared ribeye. Medium rare, juices glistening under the amber glow of chandelier light. The kind of $80 steak that promised perfection with every bite. The kind of meal people trusted without question. And yet Ethan Cole didn't reach for his knife. He didn't take a bite. He just stared at the note, his fingers hovering above the table as the low hum of conversation blurred into the background. Forks clinking, glasses touching, quiet laughter weaving through the air like nothing had changed, like everything was still normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Because now there was a question sitting heavier than the steak in front of him. Who wrote it? And more importantly, why? He leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the room with the calm precision of a man trained to notice what others ignored. A couple celebrating near the window. A businessman laughing too loudly at his own joke. A server refilling water without making eye contact. And then there was her, Naomi Brooks, moving between tables with quiet efficiency, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as if she belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Just another waitress in a pressed uniform. Just another face people forgot the moment they looked away, but Ethan didn't look away. Not now. Not after the note. He picked up his fork, not to eat, just to test, pressing gently into the steak, watching the way the blade parted the surface, the color inside just a shade off. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Not enough to cause alarm. But enough for someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. Enough for someone to risk writing a warning instead of staying silent. And that's what stopped him. Not fear, not suspicion, but the intention behind it. Because people didn't risk their jobs over nothing. Especially not people who were used to being invisible. Across the room, Naomi's hand tightened slightly around the tray she carried. A subtle shift. Almost imperceptible. But it was there, and Ethan caught it. The smallest crack in a perfectly controlled exterior. She knew. Whatever this was, she already knew, and she chose him. Out of every table, out of every guest, she chose to slip that note to him. Not the manager, not the chef, him, and that made no sense. Not unless she saw something more, something others missed, something connected to him in a way no one else in that room could understand. And that thought lingered just long enough to change everything. He unfolded the note again, reading the words a second time, slower now, letting each letter settle, letting the weight of it land. And for the first time since he sat down, Ethan Cole didn't feel like a man in control. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't planned for. Something quiet, something precise, something powerful enough to stop him before the first bite. "Sir, is everything to your liking?" The voice was smooth, practiced, the kind that never lingered long enough to invite a real answer. But Ethan did not look up right away, his eyes still fixed on the steak, on the slight inconsistency that now felt louder than the clinking glasses around him, louder than the soft jazz drifting through the room, louder than the quiet confidence this place was built on. Because once you saw something, you could not unsee it. And now the entire plate in front of him felt different, not dangerous, not obvious. Just wrong in a way that only precision could detect, and Ethan had built an empire on precision. He finally lifted his gaze, meeting the server's polite smile, but his attention moved past him, landing again on Naomi across the floor. She was clearing a table now, movements measured, efficient, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just placed a silent interruption into his night. And that control, that ability to act normal after doing something so deliberate, told him more than the note itself ever could. "Actually," Ethan said, his voice calm, almost casual, "could you tell me where this cut was sourced from?" The server blinked, just for a second, then recovered with a rehearsed confidence. "Of course, sir. It is our premium Midwest selection, USDA Prime, delivered fresh this morning." Ethan nodded slowly, as if satisfied, but his fingers tapped once against the edge of the table, a subtle rhythm. The kind that meant his mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, because he knew the sourcing, he knew the supply chain, he knew every contract tied to this restaurant, even if no one here knew who he really was. And what the server just said did not match the note in his hand, not even close. He glanced back down at the paper, reading it again. Check Table 12 supplier code. And this time, The instruction felt less like a warning and more like a test, as if someone had left him a trail instead of an answer. At table 12, a group of 4 sat halfway through their meals, laughing, unaware, one of them slicing into the same cut of steak, and Ethan watched carefully, not with panic, not with urgency, but with calculation, because whatever Naomi had seen, she had not caused a scene, she had not alerted management, she had chosen silence over spectacle, and that meant she trusted something else to happen, something controlled, something intentional. Across the room, Naomi finished clearing the table and turned slightly, her eyes lifting just enough to meet his for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to confirm what he already suspected. This was not a mistake, and she knew he would understand, not because of who he appeared to be, but because of who he actually was, even if she had no way of proving it. And that realization settled into him like a quiet shift in gravity, because for the first time that night, Ethan Cole was not the one observing from above. He was part of the system being watched, and someone he had never noticed before had just forced him to look closer than he ever planned. Table 12 just asked for the check. The words floated past like any other update, but Ethan did not move, his attention still anchored to the small details no one else seemed to notice, the angle of the knife, the color of the meat, the rhythm of the room pretending everything was fine, because that was what places like this did best. They sold certainty. They wrapped it in white linen and polished glass and made people believe nothing could go wrong here, and yet something already had. He shifted slightly in his seat, not enough to draw attention, just enough to change his view, his eyes tracking the table mentioned in the note, for guests, well-dressed, relaxed, unaware, one of them. Reaching for another bite, pausing mid-motion as if reconsidering, then continuing anyway, trusting the environment more than his instincts. And that was the difference. Ethan did not trust environments. He trusted patterns. And right now, the pattern was breaking. He reached for his phone, not to call anyone, not yet, just to open a secure internal dashboard, something no regular guest would ever have access to, something tied directly to the operational backbone of the restaurant group, supplier logs, delivery timestamps, batch codes, all of it layered beneath a system designed to look seamless from the outside. And within seconds, the numbers began to tell a different story, one that aligned far too closely with the warning in his hand. A shipment marked as premium had been logged at 6:12 that morning, but the supplier code attached to it did not match any approved vendor in the system. It was close, almost identical, a single digit off, the kind of error that would pass unnoticed in a busy kitchen, the kind of detail only someone trained to see discrepancies would catch. And suddenly, the note was no longer a suggestion, it was confirmation. Across the room, Naomi moved again, this time toward the service station, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, but Ethan saw it now, the intention behind every movement. She was not just working, she was waiting for him to act, or maybe waiting to see if he would understand, and that question lingered heavier than anything else, because she had taken a risk without knowing who he was, without knowing if he would even listen, and that kind of decision did not come from impulse. It came from knowledge. He closed the dashboard slowly, placing his phone face down on the table, his reflection faint in the dark glass. A man who had spent years controlling systems now sitting inside one that had slipped just enough to reveal a flaw, and the only person who saw it first was someone the system itself had learned to ignore. He exhaled quietly, then raised his hand just slightly, enough to signal the manager, a subtle gesture, controlled, precise. And when the manager approached with a polite smile and a posture built on authority, Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply slid the plate forward an inch and said, "Before anyone else takes another bite, I need you to verify the supplier code on this cut." The manager hesitated, just for a second, the kind of pause that reveals more than words ever could, then nodded, still smiling, still composed, but something behind his eyes shifted, something uncertain, and that was all Ethan needed to see. Across the room, Naomi stopped for a fraction of a second, her hand resting lightly on the edge of a counter, not turning, not reacting, just pausing, as if she could feel the moment tipping, as if she knew the silence she created was about to become something much louder, and in that quiet space between action and outcome, the entire room remained exactly the same, and completely different at the same time. The manager's smile did not disappear, but it no longer reached his eyes, and that was the first crack, small, almost invisible, but real, the kind of crack that spreads if you press it just enough, and Ethan did not press harder with volume. He pressed with silence, leaning back slightly, giving the man space to respond, because pressure did not always need to be loud to be effective. "Of course, sir," the manager said, his tone still smooth, still practiced, but now there was a tightness in it, a calculation forming behind every word. "There may have been a minor labeling delay from the supplier this evening, but I assure you everything we serve meets the highest standards." Ethan nodded once, slow, measured, as if accepting the explanation, but his eyes did not leave the manager's face, because he was not listening to the words. He was watching the reaction, the micro-hesitation, the way the man's shoulders held just a little too much tension for a routine question, and that was all the confirmation he needed. "Then it should be easy to verify," Ethan replied calmly, sliding the note across the table just enough for the manager to see, not dramatic, not confrontational, just deliberate. And for the first time, the manager's composure faltered completely, not in a way that would draw attention from the rest of the room, but in a way that someone trained to read people could not ignore, a flicker, quick, but unmistakable. Across the dining room, Naomi remained still, her back turned, her focus seemingly on the glassware she was arranging, but her breathing had slowed, controlled, as if she had already played this moment in her mind, as if she knew exactly how it would unfold, not because she controlled it, but because she understood it. The manager picked up the note, his eyes scanning the words, and for a second, he forgot to smile, forgot to perform, and in that second, everything shifted, because the illusion of control was gone, replaced by the reality of being seen. "I will have the kitchen double-check immediately," he said, his voice lower now, more contained, and without waiting for a response, he turned, walking quickly but not running, maintaining the appearance of order while urgency crept into every step, disappearing through the swinging doors that separated the polished dining room from the controlled chaos behind it. The room did not stop, it never did. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, a server laughed softly at something a guest said, but underneath it, there was a subtle change, like a shift in temperature no one could explain, a tension that had not been there before, quiet, but spreading. Ethan's gaze returned to Naomi, and this time, he did not look away when she turned, their eyes meeting fully, no hesitation, no pretense, and in that moment, there was no hierarchy, no customer and server, no power imbalance, just two people who understood the same thing at the same time. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong longer than anyone wanted to admit. She did not nod, she did not speak, but her expression held steady, calm, certain, and that certainty carried more weight than any explanation could. Ethan rested his hand lightly on the table, fingers still, mind already moving ahead, because this was no longer about a single plate. It was about a system that had allowed a single digit to change everything, and systems did not fail by accident. They failed because someone believed no one would notice. A few moments later, the kitchen doors pushed open again, and the manager returned, but he was not alone. The head chef stepped out beside him, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, something more cautious, and that was when the room truly shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because now, what had started as a silent note was no longer contained to one table. It was beginning to surface. And once something surfaced, it could not be hidden again. The head chef did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any explanation could, his eyes moving from the plate to the manager, then briefly across the room, as if searching for something that was no longer there, certainty, control, the quiet confidence that every dish leaving his kitchen was exactly what it claimed to be. And when his gaze returned to the steak in front of Ethan, it settled with a kind of reluctant recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but understanding. "Sir," the chef began, his voice lower than expected, measured, careful, "may I?" Ethan gestured lightly toward the plate, giving permission without words, and the chef stepped closer, leaning in just enough to examine the cut, his fingers hovering above it, but never touching, his trained eye tracing the grain, the color, the texture, and within seconds, something shifted in his expression, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. He straightened slowly, exhaling through his nose, then turned to the manager, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a question that did not need to be spoken, and the manager looked away first. That was the moment everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Because when the person responsible for excellence stopped defending it, the illusion collapsed. "We need to pause service on this cut," the chef said quietly, his voice steady but firm, and even though he did not raise it, the words carried, reaching just far enough to ripple through the nearby tables, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to be noticed, enough for people to pause mid-conversation, forks hovering, glances exchanged, the subtle awareness that something was not as perfect as it seemed. The manager nodded quickly, too quickly, already stepping back, already moving to contain what could no longer be fully contained, his hands gesturing toward the service staff, quiet instructions passed in low tones, redirecting plates, delaying orders, adjusting the flow without drawing attention. But the shift was there now, woven into the room like a new undercurrent. Across the floor, Naomi did not move right away. She watched, not openly, not obviously, but with the same quiet awareness that had led her to write the note in the first place. And when the chef spoke those words, she closed her eyes for the briefest second, not in relief, not in fear, but in confirmation, because what she had seen was real, and now, finally, someone else saw it too. Ethan remained seated, his posture unchanged, his presence calm, but inside, everything had sharpened, every detail aligning into a clearer picture, because this was no longer about one mislabeled shipment, it was about access, about how something that precise could enter a controlled system without triggering alarms, and the answer to that question was never simple, it was never accidental. He looked at the chef again, holding his gaze just long enough to establish something unspoken, respect, recognition, and the chef gave the smallest nod in return, a silent acknowledgement that whatever this was, it mattered, and it would be handled with the seriousness it deserved. A nearby guest shifted in his chair, glancing toward the paused service, curiosity replacing comfort, and another followed, then another, not panic, not concern, just awareness spreading slowly, like a whisper moving through a crowd that did not yet know the full story, but could feel that something had changed. The manager returned to Ethan's table, his composure rebuilt, but thinner now, more fragile, and placed his hands lightly in front of him, fingers interlaced in a gesture meant to project control. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We are addressing it immediately." Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded once, but he did not thank him, he did not reassure him, because this was not a favor, this was a responsibility, and the difference between the two was everything. Across the room, Naomi picked up her tray again, moving forward as if the night would continue, as if the system would reset, but there was a difference now, subtle, but undeniable, because she was no longer invisible, not to him, not to the people who had just witnessed the shift, and in that quiet transformation, the balance of the room had already begun to change, even if no one had said a word. The room did not return to normal, not really, it only pretended to, like a performance that continued after a missed cue. The music still playing, the lights still warm, but something underneath had shifted, something that could not be unseen once noticed, and Ethan felt it in the way conversations grew slightly quieter, in the way glances lingered a second longer than before, in the way the staff moved with just a hint more caution, as if the entire space had become aware of itself. He reached for his glass of water but did not drink, his focus already moving beyond the table, beyond the moment, because what had just happened was not an isolated incident. It was a signal, a small fracture in a system designed to appear flawless, and fractures did not exist alone. They spread, they connected, they revealed patterns if you knew where to look. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, decision made. He stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift his role from observer to participant, and when he moved, it was not toward the exit, it was toward the service corridor, the narrow passage where guests were not meant to go, where the polished illusion gave way to the mechanics behind it. A server stepped slightly into his path, polite but firm. "Sir, that area is restricted." But Ethan did not slow, did not argue. He simply reached into his jacket and placed a slim, matte black card into the server's hand. A single motion, quiet, controlled, and as the server's eyes dropped to read it, everything changed. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a stillness that bordered on disbelief. Ethan did not wait for permission after that. He walked forward, through the swinging doors, into the heart of the operation where the air was warmer, louder, filled with the sharp rhythm of a kitchen that had just been interrupted mid-flow. Conversations cut off as he entered, not because they knew who he was, but because they recognized something in his presence, something that did not belong to a guest, something that carried authority without needing to announce it. The head chef turned first, his expression shifting from focus to recognition in an instant, not of the man's face, but of the card now held behind him by the stunned server, and in that moment, the entire energy of the room recalibrated. "Everyone pause," the chef said, his voice clear, steady, and this time it was not a suggestion, it was a command. Burners lowered, knives set down, movements slowing into silence, the kind that only happens when people understand something important is about to be addressed. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze moving across the prep stations, the storage units, the labels, every detail now under scrutiny, because this was where truth lived, not in the dining room, not in the presentation, but here, in the process, in the small decisions that built the final result. "Show me the shipment from this morning," he said, his voice even, but carrying the kind of weight that did not invite delay, and the manager, now standing closer than before, nodded quickly, moving to comply, his earlier confidence replaced by urgency, because whatever had been hidden was no longer protected by distance. Across the threshold, just beyond the kitchen doors, Naomi stood still, her tray held close to her side, watching, not stepping in, not speaking, but present in a way she had never been before, because the moment she created had crossed the line from silent warning to visible action, and there was no turning back from that. Ethan did not look at her this time, not because he forgot, but because he did not need to. Her role in this was already clear, she had seen what others missed, she had acted when others stayed quiet, and now, the rest was his responsibility. The manager returned with a sealed container, labeled, documented, official, but Ethan did not trust labels anymore. He trusted patterns, and as he examined the code printed on the side, comparing it to what he had already seen on his system, the mismatch became undeniable, not dramatic, not obvious, but precise, intentional. The kind of discrepancy that only existed when someone believed no one would look closely enough to notice, and that belief was the real problem. He held the container up slightly, just enough for the chef to see, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he said, "This does not belong in this building." And in that sentence, simple and controlled, the entire truth began to take shape, not as an accusation, not as a spectacle, but as a correction that could not be ignored. No one in the kitchen moved to argue, not because they agreed immediately, but because the certainty in Ethan's voice left no room for debate. It was not loud, it was not forceful, it was precise, and precision carried authority that noise never could. And the head chef understood that before anyone else, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped closer to examine the container again, this time not as a routine check, but as a verification of something deeper, something that had slipped past his standards without his consent. "That code," the chef said slowly, pointing to the printed label, "it is formatted correctly, but the supplier prefix is wrong. It should never have cleared intake." And that single statement shifted the weight in the room again. Because now it was not just Ethan identifying the problem, it was the system itself acknowledging it. The manager's posture stiffened beside them, his hands clasped tighter than before, his composure thinning under the quiet pressure building around him. And for a moment, he said nothing, which said more than anything he could have offered, because silence, in the wrong moment, always revealed more than words. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze settling on him, not accusing, not aggressive, just direct, and that directness forced a response. "Walk me through intake this morning," Ethan said, his tone unchanged, but the instruction clear, and the manager swallowed once before answering. The shipment arrived at 6:12 a.m. It was logged, checked, and approved under standard protocol. his voice steady on the surface, but beneath it, something uncertain had begun to surface, something that had not been there earlier in the night. Ethan nodded once, absorbing the explanation, then asked the question that mattered: who approved it? And this time, the pause was longer, just long enough to shift the air in the room again. I did, the manager admitted, quieter now, less controlled, and in that admission, the focus narrowed, not to blame, but to responsibility. The chef exhaled slowly, stepping back half a pace, his respect for the system colliding with the reality of its failure, and Ethan let the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to settle before speaking again. You approved a supplier code that does not exist in our system, he said, not as an accusation, but as a fact, and facts, when stated plainly, carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. The manager's eyes dropped briefly, then lifted again, searching for something to hold on to. It matched the format, the packaging was sealed, everything looked consistent, he said, and that was the problem, not negligence, not intent, but assumption, the belief that consistency meant correctness, the belief that appearance equaled truth. Ethan stepped closer to the prep station, placing the container down carefully, his hand resting on it for a moment as if grounding the conversation in something tangible. Consistency can be replicated, he said calmly. Standards can be mimicked, but verification cannot be assumed. And with that, the lesson was no longer about a single mistake. It was about a mindset, one that had allowed the system to be bypassed without resistance. Across the room, one of the kitchen staff shifted slightly, absorbing the exchange, understanding that this was not just about tonight. It was about every process they trusted without question, every step they moved through on routine instead of awareness. At the doorway, Naomi remained still, her presence quiet but undeniable, and this time, Ethan glanced toward her, just briefly, not to acknowledge her publicly, not to draw attention, but to recognize the origin of the moment, because without her, none of this would have surfaced, none of this would have been questioned, and that mattered more than anything being said now. The chef looked between them, then back at Ethan, his expression sharpening with resolve. We will isolate the entire batch, trace the source, and verify every entry point, he said, not as a promise, but as a commitment, and Ethan gave a small nod, because that was what needed to happen, not panic, not reaction, but correction. The manager stood quietly, the weight of the situation settling fully now, no longer hidden behind professionalism or routine, and for the first time, he looked not like a man in control, but like a man realizing how easily control could slip when attention did. Ethan straightened slightly, his presence shifting again, not stepping back, but stepping into clarity, and when he spoke next, his voice remained even, but the meaning carried further than before. This is not about catching a mistake, he said. This is about understanding how it got here in the first place. And in that moment, the room did not feel like a kitchen anymore. It felt like the center of something much larger, something that had just been uncovered by a single note, written quietly, by someone no one had been paying attention to. The room held its breath without realizing it, not in fear, not in panic, but in awareness, the kind that settles in slowly when something familiar is suddenly questioned, and Ethan could feel it in the way every movement had become more deliberate, more careful, as if the entire kitchen had shifted from routine into reflection. The chef had already begun issuing quiet instructions, containers being set aside, labels double-checked, hands moving with precision instead of habit, but Ethan knew this was only the surface, the visible layer of a problem that ran deeper than a mislabeled shipment. He stepped toward the backstation where the intake logs were stored, a tablet mounted against stainless steel, its screen still open to the morning entries, timestamps lined up neatly, everything appearing correct at first glance. And that was exactly the problem. It looked right. Pull the security footage from the receiving dock, Ethan said, not raising his voice, but directing it with clarity, and the manager hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, before nodding and moving quickly to comply, because hesitation was no longer something he could afford. The chef glanced at Ethan, then at the tablet, understanding the shift in direction. This was no longer about correcting a mistake. This was about tracing intent, and intent left patterns that systems alone could not hide. Moments later, the footage flickered onto the screen, grainy but clear enough, A delivery truck arriving just after dawn, staff moving in and out, boxes being unloaded, routine, predictable, until Ethan leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, focusing not on the movement, but on the sequence, the order, the timing, because patterns were never about what happened, they were about when and how it happened. Pause it there, he said, pointing to a frame where one of the containers was set aside for just a second longer than the others, not dropped, not mishandled, just delayed, a small deviation, almost invisible, but intentional in its own quiet way. The chef leaned in, following Ethan's line of sight, and now he saw it too, the extra second, the slight repositioning, the way the label faced inward instead of outward, details that meant nothing to someone rushing through a morning delivery, but everything to someone looking for precision. That crate, Ethan said, his voice calm, but final. Track it from that moment forward. And the manager scrubbed through the footage, faster now, urgency replacing uncertainty, until the container appeared again inside the kitchen, logged, processed, approved, slipping through each checkpoint exactly as it was designed to, because no one had been looking for what was wrong. They had only been confirming what looked right. Across the doorway, Naomi watched, her expression unchanged, but her presence now carried a different weight, not invisible anymore, not overlooked, because what she had seen with her eyes alone was now being confirmed by systems, by footage, by authority, and that shift did not need to be announced, it was understood. Ethan straightened slowly, stepping back from the screen, his mind already assembling the sequence into something clearer, something undeniable, because this was not an accident. It was not random, it was precise, calculated, designed to blend into normal operations without disruption, and that meant someone had studied the system closely enough to know exactly where it would not be questioned. He turned to the manager, his gaze steady, not accusing, but unyielding. This passed through every checkpoint because everyone trusted the process more than they verified it. He said, and the words landed heavier than any confrontation could have, because they were not directed at one person, they were directed at the entire structure that had allowed this to happen. The chef exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the counter as he looked at the paused frame on the screen. The moment everything had slipped through, and for the first time, his voice carried something beyond control. It carried responsibility. We will rebuild the intake protocol from this point forward, he said quietly, not as a reaction, but as a correction, and Ethan gave a small nod, because that was where change began, not in blame, but in awareness. The kitchen remained still for a moment longer, the image on the screen frozen in time. A single second stretched into something far more significant, and just beyond the doorway, Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her grip on the tray relaxing, not because the situation was over, but because it had finally been seen, truly seen, and in that quiet recognition, the balance had already changed. The screen went dark as the footage ended, but the image stayed in everyone's mind, that single second, that one quiet deviation that had slipped through an entire system built on precision, and in the silence that followed, no one rushed to speak, because there was nothing left to explain, only something left to understand. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting it settle, not just in the room, but in the people, because correction without understanding always failed, and what mattered now was not just fixing the process, it was changing how it was seen. He turned slowly, his gaze moving across the kitchen, meeting each set of eyes not as a stranger, not as a guest, but as someone who now belonged to the moment. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but it carried a different weight, something clearer, something undeniable. My name is Ethan Cole, he said, and the room did not react immediately, not because they did not hear him, but because the name had not yet connected, not yet landed, and then it did, quietly, like everything else that night, recognition spreading not through noise, but through stillness. The manager's posture shifted first, shoulders straightening, eyes widening just slightly, followed by the chef, who stepped back half a pace, understanding now not just the authority in Ethan's voice, but the source of it, the man who built the system they had trusted without question now standing inside it, questioning it. Ethan did not wait for a reaction. He did not need one. Because this was not about revealing himself. It was about reinforcing what had already been proven. He glanced once toward the doorway, toward Naomi, who remained exactly where she had been, her presence unchanged, steady, grounded, and for the first time, he addressed her directly. "You saw it before anyone else," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, and every head in the room turned, not because he raised his voice, but because of what he chose to acknowledge. Naomi did not step forward right away. She did not lower her gaze. She simply met his eyes, calm, certain, the same way she had when she wrote the note, and that calm carried its own kind of strength, the kind that did not need validation to exist. "I noticed the grain," she said, her voice even, and the label did not match the cut. Simple words, no performance, no need to impress, just truth. And in that moment, the entire room understood what had been overlooked, not just a detail, but a person capable of seeing it. Ethan nodded once, a small gesture, but deliberate, because recognition mattered, especially when it had been absent before. "You did not make a scene," he said, "you made it precise." And there was something in that statement that shifted more than the situation. It shifted the way she was seen. The chef looked at Naomi differently now, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who had protected the integrity of his kitchen when the system failed to. And even the manager, still absorbing the weight of everything, lowered his gaze briefly, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. Ethan stepped back slightly, his role no longer to uncover, but to decide what came next, and his voice remained steady as he spoke again. "Effective immediately, we audit every supplier entry across all locations, no exceptions." And the instruction moved through the room like a reset, clear, actionable, necessary. Then he paused, just long enough to let the next part land, because it mattered just as much. "And from this moment forward, attention is not a position, it is a responsibility," he said, and the words settled deeper than any command could, because they applied to everyone in that room. Naomi shifted her grip on the tray, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not because she had been recognized, but because what she saw had been validated, and that was enough. Ethan turned once more toward the kitchen, then toward the doorway, then back again, taking in the space that now felt different, not because the lights had changed, not because the music had stopped, but because the truth had surfaced, quietly, precisely, and once it did, nothing in that room would ever be invisible again.